The moment I heard the whisper through the thin wall, my stomach dropped. It wasn't just the hushed tone of his voice that startled me. It was the urgency in it, the kind of edge that made my skin prickle. I froze mid-step in the dimly lit hallway, ears straining to catch the words. "She can't find out." "Not yet," my brother's voice murmured, low and almost frantic. A second voice answered, muffled and harder to make out. I leaned closer to the wall, feeling my heart pound in my chest like a trapped bird. Who was he talking to? What couldn't I know? I didn't mean to eavesdrop. It wasn't like I wanted to snoop on my own brother, but something about his tone felt wrong. There was a weight to his words that made me hold my breath, afraid to even exhale. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak and whisper feel amplified. It was late, past midnight, and I should have been asleep like everyone else. But now I couldn't move, couldn't look away from the sliver of light spilling out beneath his door. "Are you sure you can keep this under control?" the second voice asked. I couldn't hear my brother's response, but I heard the sharp scrape of his chair against the floor, followed by hurried footsteps. Before I had time to think, his door swung open. There he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he saw me standing there, caught in the act. "Eavesdropping, are we?" he asked, his voice dripping with an unsettling mix of amusement and annoyance. I stammered, trying to come up with some excuse for being in the hallway at this hour. I was just going to the kitchen for water." His gaze lingered on me for a moment too long, scanning my face as if he didn't believe a word I was saying. Then he stepped closer, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. "Water, huh?" he said, his tone soft but far from reassuring. "At this hour?" My throat went dry. I nodded, clutching at the hem of my oversized sweatshirt as though it might somehow shield me from the intensity of his stare. Something about the way he looked at me felt different, unfamiliar even. It wasn't the playful, teasing expression I'd grown up with. No, this was something else entirely, and it made me want to shrink into the shadows. "You didn't hear anything, did you?" he asked, his voice calm, but his eyes held a quiet warning. I shook my head quickly. "No, nothing." He smiled then, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "Good. Let's keep it that way." And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving me rooted to the spot, my mind racing. Whatever he was hiding, I had the sinking feeling that it was about to change everything. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unease from my chest. Every time I thought about last night, his tone, the way he looked at me, the warning in his smile, I felt a prickling sensation that refused to leave. What was he hiding? And why did it feel like it had something to do with me? The kitchen was quiet when I came downstairs, sunlight streaming through the blinds in sharp beams. I found him there, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in hand, his hair still damp from a shower. He looked up when I entered, his eyes immediately locking onto mine. "You're up early," he said, his voice light, but there was a trace of something beneath the surface, an edge I couldn't quite place. "Couldn't sleep," I mumbled, moving to pour myself a glass of water. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the glass, and I cursed myself for being so obvious. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't until I turned to face him again that he spoke, his voice quieter now. "About last night." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. Did he know I'd heard more than I let on? "What about it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He set his coffee cup down on the counter and took a step closer. The space between us felt suddenly too small, the air thick with something I couldn't name. "I meant what I said," he said, his gaze steady. "You didn't hear anything, right?" I shook my head quickly, my throat dry. "No. I told you. I didn't hear anything." For a moment he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, doubt maybe, or suspicion. "Good," he said finally. "Let's leave it at that." But the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it seemed to grow heavier, settling over the room like a thick fog. I tried to focus on drinking my water, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. "I don't like secrets," I blurted out suddenly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He raised an eyebrow, his lips quirking into a faint smirk. "No one does," he said. "But some things are better left unsaid." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I didn't know if it was the tone of his voice or the way he was looking at me, like he was daring me to push further. But I didn't. I couldn't. The rest of the day passed in a blur of unease and unanswered questions. I avoided him as much as I could, keeping myself busy with chores and errands. But no matter what I did, I couldn't stop thinking about him, his voice, his words, the way he seemed to be hiding something just beneath the surface. That night, I found myself sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with a movie. The house was quiet, everyone else already in their rooms. I thought I was alone until I felt his presence behind me. "You're still awake?" he asked, his voice low. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. He looked different in the shadows, softer almost, but there was still that edge to him, the thing that made my pulse quicken. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Couldn't sleep." He stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place sent a jolt of awareness through me, and I suddenly felt hyper-aware of everything. The way the couch dipped slightly as he sat down beside me, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air, the quiet sound of his breathing. "What are you watching?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was a tension in the way he spoke, a tightness that mirrored my own. I shrugged, unable to focus on the screen with him sitting so close. "Just something random," I said. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint sounds from the TV. I could feel the heat of his body beside me, the way his arm brushed against mine when he shifted slightly. Every small movement felt amplified, every touch sending a spark of awareness through me. "You've been avoiding me," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "No, I haven't," I said quickly, but even I could hear the lie in my voice. He turned to look at me then, his gaze intense. "Yes, you have," he said. "Why?" "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know." For a moment, he didn't say anything, just looked at me with that same unreadable expression. Then he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, but the words felt hollow. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes searching mine. "Then what is it?" I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain the way he made me feel, the confusion, the tension, the way my heart raced every time he was near? "I don't know," I said again, my voice barely audible. He didn't move for a moment, just sat there, his hand still resting lightly against mine. Then slowly he leaned closer, his breath warm against my skin. "It's okay," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You don't have to say anything." And just like that, the tension snapped. The air between us felt electric, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. The house was quiet again that night. The kind of stillness that felt alive, as though it were waiting for something to happen. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, replaying every word, every look, every charged silence between us. It was like trying to piece together a puzzle when you didn't know what the final picture was supposed to be. I told myself to go to sleep, to shut off my thoughts and bury the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. But I couldn't. The knock at my door was soft, hesitant. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Hey!" His voice came through the door, low and familiar. "You still awake?" For a moment I didn't respond. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought he might hear it through the door. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice barely audible. The door opened just enough for him to step inside, his silhouette dark against the hallway light. He closed it behind him, and the latch clicked softly, sending another jolt through me. He leaned against the door for a moment, his hands in his pockets, his head tilted slightly as he looked at me. There was something different in his eyes tonight, something I couldn't name but that made my chest tighten. "Couldn't sleep," he said simply, and I nodded, unsure of what to say. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, until he was standing just a few feet away. The room felt smaller with him in it, the air heavier. "Neither could I," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. I looked up at him then, my pulse racing. His eyes were on mine, and for a moment it felt like the rest of the world disappeared. It was just us, suspended in this charged silence, and I couldn't look away. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another step closer, closing the distance between us until he was standing directly in front of me. I could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of his cologne. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice soft. I couldn't stay away." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. My heart was racing, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and something else, something I didn't want to name. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the earth shifted beneath me. My breath hitched and I pulled back instinctively, but he didn't let go. "Don't," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Don't pull away." I looked up at him, my mind screaming at me to say something, to do something, but I couldn't. I was frozen, caught between the fear of what this was and the undeniable pull that had been growing between us for days, weeks, maybe longer. And then he leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate, giving me time to stop him, to push him away. But I didn't. I couldn't. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But when I didn't, he kissed me fully, his hands coming up to cradle my face. The world tilted, everything else fading away as I kissed him back, my own hands tangling in his shirt. It was desperate, raw, and overwhelming, a storm of emotions I couldn't begin to process. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, our foreheads resting against each other. This is wrong," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Maybe," he said, his voice low and filled with something I couldn't place. "But it doesn't feel wrong." I pulled back then, my mind racing. "We can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't." He looked at me, his expression torn. "I know," he said quietly. "But I can't stop." Neither could I, though I couldn't bring myself to admit it. For a moment we just stood there, the silence between us heavy with everything we weren't saying. Then he reached out again, his hand brushing against mine. And I felt that same spark, that same undeniable pull. But this time I stepped back. "You should go," I said, my voice barely audible. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "Are you sure?" I nodded, even though every part of me wanted to say no. "Please," I said, my voice breaking. "Just go." He stared at me for a moment longer before nodding slowly. "Okay," he said quietly. He turned and walked to the door, his hand resting on the handle for a moment before he looked back at me. "Good night," he said softly, and then he was gone. As soon as the door closed behind him, I sank onto the bed, my head in my hands. My heart was racing, my mind a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. What had I just done? What had we just done? I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, felt his touch, heard his voice. And no matter how much I tried to push it away, I couldn't escape the truth. I didn't regret it. Not one bit. But the guilt was there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to consume me. And I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The next morning was brutal. I'd barely slept, and every sound in the house felt amplified. Every movement like an unwelcome reminder of the night before. I avoided the kitchen, the living room, anywhere he might be. But it was impossible to avoid him forever. I found him in the hallway, leaning against the wall as though he'd been waiting for me. His eyes met mine, and the tension crackled between us like a live wire. "Hey," he said softly, his voice cautious. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My hands were trembling, so I stuffed them into my pockets, trying to appear calm. "About last night," he began, but I cut him off. "Don't," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. "We can't talk about it." He hesitated, his expression conflicted. "We can't just pretend it didn't happen." "We have to," I said firmly, though my resolve was crumbling with every passing second. "We don't have a choice." He took a step closer, and I backed away instinctively. "Do you really believe that?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "Because I don't." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Please," I whispered. "Just let it go." He didn't reply, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't going to let it go. And that terrified me. The air between us crackled, the silence stretching long and taut like a rubber band on the verge of snapping. It was as if every emotion, every unsaid word, had pooled into this moment, weighing it down, making it impossible to breathe. His eyes met mine, not with the guarded detachment I was used to, but with something raw, something real. Something that demanded a response. "Say something," he finally said, his voice low, almost a growl. "Anything." My throat was dry, the words stuck somewhere between my heart and my mouth. I wanted to deny it, to deflect, to laugh it off as though we weren't standing here on the edge of something neither of us could take back. But his gaze pinned me in place, demanding the truth. And the truth burned. I don't know what to say, I whispered, and even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. I knew exactly what I wanted to say, what I wanted to do. But giving voice to it felt like stepping off a cliff, with no idea how far the fall would be. Liar, he said, stepping closer. Just one step, but it closed the gap enough that I could feel the heat of him, smell the faint trace of his cologne mixed with something uniquely his. You know exactly what you want to say. You're just scared. My chest tightened, my pulse pounding in my ears. He was right. Of course he was right. But fear wasn't the only thing holding me back. There was guilt, too thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around my ribs like a vice. What if we were wrong? What if this wasn't what I thought it was? What if I ruined everything? This is crazy, I said, shaking my head. We can't, we shouldn't. Stop it, he interrupted, his voice sharp, cutting through my spiraling thoughts. Stop pretending you don't feel it. Stop pretending you don't want this. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine, and the contact sent a jolt through me, as though I'd been struck by lightning. My breath hitched, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was feel the warmth of his skin, the way his fingers curled slightly, as if waiting for me to take the next step, to close the distance. And then I did. Before I could second-guess myself, before the fear could creep back in, I closed the gap between us, my lips crashing against his. It was desperate and messy and completely unplanned, but it was also everything. Every suppressed feeling, every stolen glance, every unspoken word, all poured into this one moment. It was like breaking the surface after being underwater for too long, like finally breathing again. He responded immediately, his hands coming up to cup my face, his touch firm but tender. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just pure, unfiltered emotion. And it terrified me as much as it thrilled me, because there was no going back now. No pretending this didn't happen. No pretending we could go back to the way things were before. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard, our foreheads pressed together as we tried to catch our breath. His hands were still on my face, his thumbs gently stroking my cheeks, and for a moment I let myself believe this could work, that we could have this without everything falling apart. Tell me you don't regret it, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Tell me this isn't just in my head. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come, because I didn't regret it. Not in the slightest. But admitting that out loud felt like admitting something much bigger, much scarier. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I don't regret it, I finally said, my voice trembling but firm. But I don't know what this means. For us. For everything. He nodded, his expression serious but not angry. We'll figure it out. Together. The word hung between us, heavy with promise. Together. It sounded so simple, so easy, but I knew it wouldn't be. This wasn't just about us. There were other people, other lives, other consequences to consider. And yet, in that moment, with his hands on my face and his eyes locked on mine, it felt like we could handle anything. Like we could face whatever came next, as long as we had each other. But the fallout was immediate. The moment we stepped back, the moment reality crept back in, the weight of what we'd just done came crashing down. It was like a dam breaking. All the emotions we'd been holding back flooding out at once. There was guilt and fear and doubt, yes, but there was also something else. Something stronger. Something that refused to be ignored. This changes everything, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. I know, he said, his tone steady but laced with an edge of determination. But it doesn't have to be a bad thing. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could come out of this unscathed, that we could find a way to make this work. But the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, reminding me of everything we stood to lose. What if we're wrong? I asked, my voice trembling. What if this ruins everything? Then it ruins everything, he said, his tone unwavering. But I'd rather ruin everything than spend another day pretending I don't feel this. Pretending I don't want this. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, stealing the breath from my lungs. Because he was right. As terrifying as this was, as high as the stakes were, the thought of walking away felt even worse. The thought of pretending this never happened, of going back to the way things were, felt unbearable. Okay, I said, the word barely more than a whisper. Okay. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't an answer. But it was a start. A step forward into the unknown, into the chaos. Together. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation, like everything had come to a standstill. It wasn't the first time the tension between us had been palpable, but tonight it felt different. Too much had been left unsaid. Too many looks exchanged. Too many moments lingering, just a heartbeat too long. He stepped closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His hand brushed mine just a touch at first, but the electric shock that shot up my arm told me this was no accident. His eyes locked with mine, dark with something raw and unspoken. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so loud I thought he could hear it. I had known somewhere deep down what this moment was building to, but now that it was here I couldn't escape it. He wasn't going to back down. Are you going to stop me? His voice was low, controlled, but there was a hint of desperation, as if he were daring me to say something, anything that could stop this. But I didn't. I couldn't. The distance between us was vanishing, and before I could think, his lips were on mine, demanding, urgent, like he had been waiting forever. I was frozen, my body caught in that split second of confusion and disbelief. But then something inside me snapped and I kissed him back, no longer holding back. All the words we hadn't said, all the longing we'd buried, poured out in that kiss. His hands moved, grasping me with a hunger I hadn't known he had, pulling me closer until we were pressed against each other, skin to skin, the heat between us consuming. In that moment there was no hesitation. There were no boundaries. The world outside the room didn't exist anymore. It was just us, lost in a storm of emotions, physical and raw. But as the kiss deepened, so did the weight of what we were doing. Every touch, every gasp, felt like a step further into a place we couldn't return from. I could feel his heartbeat matching mine, erratic, out of control. The desire was undeniable, but so was the fear. I pulled back, my breath ragged, trying to catch my bearings. His eyes, dark with desire, were searching mine, waiting for a response. This changes everything, I whispered, my voice trembling, torn between regret and something else. Something I didn't want to acknowledge. But he didn't back down. He leaned in again, not giving me the chance to retreat, pushing me further into a space where the consequences no longer mattered. In that moment I knew it was too late. The aftermath hit us almost immediately. The weight of our actions hung in the air like a cloud. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes now, the same doubt creeping into my own chest. What had we done? What had we become? But even as the questions lingered, there was something else there. A shared understanding, a silent agreement that this was only the beginning. There would be no going back. And somehow that terrified and thrilled me all at once. The night had turned cold, a stark contrast to the heat that had consumed us only moments ago. My body felt heavy, like the weight of everything that had just happened was pressing down on me, suffocating. He was sitting across the room now, his back against the wall, eyes cast downward as if trying to make sense of it all, or maybe hoping that if he stared at the floor long enough, everything would vanish. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't meet his gaze without feeling the rawness of what we had just shared, the intensity of it still vibrating in the air between us. There was a lump in my throat, but no words could come. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. What was there to say? How did we even begin to unpack something like this? I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the sound of my own breathing, the only thing that felt real in the chaos of my mind. But everything had shifted. My thoughts were scattered, pieces of what had just happened breaking apart with every passing second. Guilt gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. It whispered at the back of my mind, telling me that what we did was wrong, that it could never be right. Shame twisted in my stomach, a deep, gnawing ache that I couldn't push away. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something inside me had wanted it, had needed it, and now we were here at this impossible crossroads. But then there was another feeling, one that I didn't dare to acknowledge. Something darker, more dangerous. A sense of liberation, of freedom in having crossed that line. It wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional. For the first time in so long, I felt like I was truly alive, unshackled, free from all the things that had held me back. But was it worth it? Was this feeling enough to erase the weight of what we had done? The room felt suffocating, yet neither of us moved. The silence was oppressive, and I realized we were both waiting for what I wasn't sure. Maybe for the other to speak first, to say something that would make sense of the madness, to offer some explanation. But neither of us did. We both knew that no words could fix this. I finally stood up, my legs shaky, my head spinning. My body was betraying me, remembering everything, every touch, every kiss, the heat of his skin pressed against mine. It was still with me like a fire that wouldn't burn out. My hands trembled as I reached for my clothes, pulling them back on with shaky fingers. When I looked up, I found his eyes on me, heavy with something unreadable. He didn't say a word, but his gaze felt like a question, one that lingered in the air between us. "Is it over?" I finally asked, the words falling out before I could stop them. His eyes flickered, almost as if he were caught off guard by the question. But he didn't answer. He couldn't. There were no answers, not now, not yet. He seemed to be lost in his own thoughts, torn between the consequences of what we'd done and the undeniable truth that what had just transpired was inevitable, something neither of us could have avoided. I turned toward the door, the weight of the moment too much to bear. But before I reached the threshold, I felt a hand on my arm. His grip was gentle, almost hesitant, but it stopped me. I turned, and for the briefest second, our eyes locked. No words spoken, but everything we felt passed between us in that single moment. A mixture of desire, fear, and uncertainty, tangled together in a web too complicated to unravel. Then he let go, and I stepped out of the room, the door closing softly behind me. I didn't look back. The coldness of the hallway felt like a slap to the face, the chill making me feel more isolated than ever. I moved through the house like a ghost, my heart pounding in my chest, my body reacting to the memory of him. Outside, the night air hit me like a cold slap to the face. It was sharp, cleansing, but it couldn't wash away what had happened. My heart was still racing, my mind still spinning. I didn't know what the future held, or if I'd ever be able to look him in the eye again without feeling that undeniable pull. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The events of tonight were not some passing moment. They had carved their mark into the fabric of everything I had known. As I walked into the night, the weight of it all felt like a chain around my chest. I didn't know if I'd ever see him again, or if I would have the courage to face him if I did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated. Perhaps there was no turning back. Or perhaps there was something deeper pulling us both forward, a force neither of us understood. The night stretched on, empty and cold, as I walked away from it all. But the pull to return to confront it was always there, waiting.